Okay, folks. Well, when I wrote this title down, I didn't realize that it could be misconstrued. I'm not talking about dust mites, nor am I advocating a more diverse nocturnal fauna in your bed. I'm talking about the concept of biodiversity, the kind of stuff that we see on reefs. So this is the biodiversity that we're all interested in, the kind of stuff that we kind of have a universal acceptance is really important, and people talk about conservation of biodiversity. And there's very little argument. This is something that we all accept should be done and that we can realize the benefits of. In terms of biodiversity, it's been the foundation for things like the RAP program on the biodiversity protection for the barrier reef. And it was one of the key things. So there's fisheries advantages, but it was primarily for the protection of biodiversity. And equally, when we come to things like hotspots, now, this was an interesting one. The Coral Triangle is for protecting biodiversity. That's what unifies it as an area, is the number of species that's there. This group is interested in protecting species, but it managed to lose Australia, which is a bit disconcerting. But the main goal of these groups is to protect that biodiversity. That's what carries it through. And if you think of systems and where people are going to work, they'll look at, say, reefs and rainforests. Why are these good systems? Because of their biodiversity. So every time you think of conservation, biodiversity almost immediately comes through as one of the justifications and the reasons. And people are interested in it. And whilst people will say, well, look, there's lots of different kinds of biodiversity, when it comes to the nitty-gritty, it's often the number of species that's the primary criterion that's used. So people will count species richness, and that gives you an indication of how important or how valuable an area is. Now, species richness itself is a useful metric. You can say that an area with 2,000 species is more important than one with 200 species, because if you're conserving large areas there, you get a bigger bang for your buck. So it's economically more effective to protect areas with lots of species, and therefore it's a rational decision to protect those areas. There's also other advantages in terms of biodiversity, and that's been based on the insurance that it gives you in terms of the potential for stability and for ecosystems to be maintained because of the species that are there. So if you go to an area and you've got multiple species, there's the suggestion that if you've got lots of species, if one species is lost, there's another one that's going to be able to take its place, its functional role will be maintained, and that system is going to continue to work because you have this functional redundancy. And there's also a possibility of something called response diversity. If you've got lots of species, the chances of them all behaving in the same way is reduced, so that if you lose a species or a number of species, there's a chance that something else will be able to take over the job. So higher biodiversity equates to better functional redundancy, increased insurance and security that the processes are going to continue, and that we have a system that's very good. So biodiversity is not only pretty, it's also very important. So there's all of these logical reasons for maintaining it. So that is, in essence, what helps us sleep better at night. We know that there's some security that comes from that biodiversity. It is going to keep us going. Now, I've been saying for years that it may not be so. So each time I stand up here, I usually talk about the favorite fish of the year and say, oh, no, some are more important than others. So yes, we all say that biodiversity is important, but species aren't all equally important. Some are more important than others. So something like a parrotfish or a batfish or rabbitfishes, each of them does something that's quite unique and quite different and, in my view, quite important. But the problem is that I could just be cherry-picking these things to make a point. So I might just be blathering on about my favorite fish and trying to convince you that they're important. But what we need is some degree of objectivity. We need to take a step back and look at it at a global scale. We need to look at it outside the favorite group of mine, which are the herbivores. And we need to be able to look at species in general and say whether or not they're able to fulfill the roles that I think are important on reefs. So what I did is I worked with a group overseas. It's mainly based, David Muyo, who was a former visiting professor in the center. He worked in the University of Montpellier. With David and a group of other people, we were looking at the nature of biodiversity, and what we were interested in, we came from 5 countries. There were researchers with their own experiences. We had different countries, different backgrounds, but one common unified goal, and that was to understand the role of fishes on reefs around the world. So we wanted to see whether or not these exceptions that I've been describing really did apply if you look at the broader picture. So what we did is, initially we described regions. So all of this data was pulled together, and the first goal was to describe biogeographic regions. In other words, what areas of the world can we divide up in a logical way? And this was the first paper. Once we've done that, we can then move on and start to work with these species in more detail. Because of the number of people working on it, we were able to look at a large number of species, and this included 6,316 species that occur on reefs around the globe. We had their distributions, we knew where they occurred. What we were interested in is their abilities. Now for this, we had to get a proxy, and we looked at traits. These are broad traits, so we had size, mobility, activity in terms of movement around the reef, schooling behavior, position in the water column, and diet. And for each of these is a number afterwards, and that is the number of categories we had in each of those traits. Now, the results are fairly insensitive to the number of categories you choose, but we did look at it. So in total, we had something like 5,600 different possible trait combinations, and of those, about 650 were actually occupied. So in other words, these categorize broad kinds of fish. So the one on the top, that's an apogonid. It's a small, less than 10 centimeters, mobile within the reef, nocturnal schooling, etc. That categorizes the kind of fish that it is. And the carangid on the bottom, medium size, mobile, diurnal schooling, etc. It characterizes that species. So these are broad functional classifications. They're putting them into very, very broad functional groups. So once we have these things in these functional groups, we can start to look at the nature of their distribution in terms of what you'd expect to find in terms of their occupancy across all of the species within a system. So if we graph them, so this is the standard approach, the functional entities, as we call them, these are these functional groups, the different kinds of fish, are on the bottom, and the number of species in each one are going to be ranked from left to right. And that's on the vertical axis, which is the number of species that we find in each of these functional entities. So this is a picture of how the species of various types pack into the biodiversity that we see. So the first entity might, for example, be a medium-sized fish that's mobile between reefs, etc. That's one entity, and then the question is, well, how many species fit into that entity? The expectation, if we have high or low diversity systems, if they were evenly allocated to all of these entities, would be for them to be even across the range of entities that are occupied, and you'd have a higher number of species in the high diversity systems and a lower number in the low diversity systems. But you might say, well, hang on, no, the real world doesn't work like that. If you just randomly put them into these various entities, you're going to get a different distribution, and indeed you do. You expect something more like this. So there are some entities where you may get more species, and there's other entities where you may get virtually none. So there's one. So there's this distribution of entities in terms of their relative species richness. So those are the two kind of null expectations. And what we're interested in is the real world. How does the real world map onto this? So those are the expectations plotted in terms of real world levels, taking the data from the reef systems we examined, and that's what the expectation would be. And the results, when you put them on, look like that. That's a low diversity system. What it means is there are huge numbers of fishes packed into a handful of functional entities. So this here is something that we call functional over-redundancy. 40% of species are packed into areas where there's lots and lots of species doing the same thing. It's more of the same. We also get large numbers down here where there's singletons. This is why we don't call them functional groups, because they're not groups, because there's just one. So in this system, the East Pacific, 54% of species occur in a functional type all of their own. So they're a very, very vulnerable type of functional entity because there's only one species doing it. So the overall view is one of kind of this in balance between lots of things doing the same thing and one's all spread out. And you can say, well, look, of course that's like that. That's East Pacific. I've picked an example which is really bad because there's not enough species in the East Pacific. It's scratching itself up to become a coral reef system. It's squeezing in whatever species it can get, and of course there's going to be a vulnerability. But if you go to a high diversity system, somewhere like the Barrier Reef, there's a lot more species, and therefore they're going to flood into that area that's functionally vulnerable, and it's going to look a hell of a lot better. So we know that high diversity systems aren't going to have the same degree of vulnerability because they've got more species. Biodiversity is going to save us. So if you look in a high diversity system, it looks like that. Is it different? No. Most of the new extra species have gone and packed themselves into exactly the same functional entities that they were there in the low diversity system. So high diversity is not really spreading out the functions, it's concentrating them even more. So now we have 58% of species over redundant. Now I wanted to call this redundant redundancy, but the reviewers got rather upset. Saying, are you trying to suggest that some species are useless? Anyway. But there's this excessive over redundancy. So is the system a little bit safer? Well, yes. There's a slight decrease in the single species entities, but it's still more than a third of the species are sat there on their own in these vulnerable entities. So high diversity systems, we can summarize it. They're just as vulnerable in terms of exposure to these under-occupied functional entities as low diversity systems. So, does this happen all over the world? Well, yes. Most of the major ocean basins are showing roughly the same kind of pattern of over-redundancy and vulnerability. It's slightly different, but it is generally the same pattern no matter where you go. If you look in more detail, if you really get down and focus in on specific areas, what you see is vast tracts of the oceans have the same level of over-redundancy, vulnerability, the same kind of pattern. There is a little bit heightened vulnerability in peripheral areas, which you'd possibly expect, but it isn't a great swathe of areas where there's vulnerable or not vulnerable. It's all pretty much the same. So the question is, in terms of looking at this pattern, what are these species? What's going on in here? What's driving this? And as with almost everything that you look at on reefs, it's evolution. So the evolutionary history is putting these patterns into place. So what are the species? Well, if we look and say, these vulnerable species, which are these? The singletons, the ones where there's just one species in a group, they tend to be things that we're familiar with. We look at them and go, hang on, we've seen these kind of things before. Moray eels, bulbometapon. There's nothing else like bulbometapon. You lose bulbometapon. There's no bulbometapon 2. There's nothing that's closely mirroring it. It is what it is. So this is an aspect of biodiversity which is important. These are vulnerable because of their distinctness. And in terms of the great scheme of things, these are ecologically distinct, but they're also evolutionarily quite differentiated and distinct, and they're often quite old. So these are things that often in a cladogram come off at the earlier branches. They're older species, and they're quite different. In terms of the over-redundant species, what are those? Well, in high diversity systems, these are the core of the hotspot. These are the species that make the Indonesian hotspot the hotspot. So this is what is driving that real high quality biodiversity. What are these? Well, we can look at them. It's the evolution of these, again, that's putting them in place. So we've looked at evolution before. So this is the evolution of the IA hotspot. I've shown this before. What this is showing that it's got a long history. It's about 30-odd million years where the hotspot in the Australian archipelago came into being. But this is describing how it evolved in terms of lineages. So these are lineages through time that put that hotspot in place. What the hotspot is defined on is species. So the question is, where did the species come from? And what this does, it has to be put into context in terms of how reefs were structured. So for coral reefs, this is a summary of the 6 major phases in the evolution of coral reef fishes. What we're interested in is the last 3 phases, 4, 5, and 6. That's past the KT boundary. That's where the mass extinction event where modern reefs appeared. In phase 4, this is when you get all the origins of reef fish families. So all the families that you know, they came in that phase. It's between about 65 and 35 million years ago. If you go to phase 5, This is between 35 and about 5 million years ago, and this is when all the genera appeared. So the vast majority of genera were clicking into place there. The last phase in the last 5 million years are when the species appeared. And these are the last thing that put the icing on the cake and produced reefs as we see them today. Phase 4 and 5 are based largely on major changes in function. Reefs were developing, they were getting their characteristics, they were going into place. Phase 6, where we get the origin of most species, is largely based on color. So we can go into some detail in this, and we can look, this is the most well-resolved species-level phylogenetic tree for reef fishes available. And you can hone in on that and find out how old species are on a reef. If you look at the phylogenetic, the total phylogeny level species age, they're about 5.4 million years old. If you only look at the recent divergences, which you can have confidence in, these are the best species ages, they're about 2.9 million years old. So most of the fishes you see on the reef are about 2.9 million years old. That's how old species are. And the question that comes from this is, this is biodiversity. This is the creation, this is the biodiversity that you're all protecting. So the question is, what does biodiversity look like? On the hoof, real live biodiversity. And the reality is it looks like this. That is biodiversity. That is what your management things are in place for. That is what you're protecting. So I'm looking at it from a fish point of view. I suspect it applies to most of the other groups. But what these are is, quite frankly, between you and me, they're bright, they're colorful, they're beautiful, they're pretty, they're greens, they're blues, they're black, they're white, they're striped. These descriptive terms are all color. There's nothing fundamentally different in these things. They're just variation on a theme. They're nothing more than baubles on the tree of life. They're meaningless in most real respects. So we've got to be very, very careful when we talk about biodiversity. Which biodiversity are we actually protecting? So I've got a problem. Look, this is fish, but I think that it applies elsewhere. But we've been protecting this. We've been dazzled by these colors. And I think what's happened is we're like little kids. Well, one of us is anyway. As a consequence, I wanted to express this to you. Now, if you ask the question, did I spend 4 hours playing with Lego to get this slide? Yes. But it was a worthwhile 4 hours, trust me. Anyway, but I think this is how we see reefs. This is how reefs are. This is my worldview of reefs. They're nice, they're colorful, they're beautiful, but they're functional. Things do things in this reef world. You sit on your reef motorbike and it moves, it goes, it does things. But because we're protecting biodiversity with the primary criterion being color, we've substituted this kind of functional reef for this. It's colorful, it's bright, it does everything. But if you ask the Lego man sat on the motorbike, does it go as fast? The answer is no. It doesn't really function. I know you can't speak to Lego, but what we've done is we've substituted potential functionality for appearance. And most of the biodiversity that we're seeing that we're protecting is appearance. So we've got to be very, very careful. So biodiversity was okay to protect when we were naive. When we knew nothing about how reefs worked, you've got to protect something, so protect everything. It's a logical, reasonable, rational decision. But we know a lot more now. So Jeremy got up and he didn't say the Caribbean reefs are in real trouble and what we've got to do is protect biodiversity. He said we've got to protect specific functionally important groups like parrotfishes. It was as clear as day what the priority was. It wasn't biodiversity, it was functionality that was missing, and that is the key. And that's why we've got to be careful. So, in terms of biodiversity, this is what we've got. The hotspot is driven mainly by 58% over redundancy. We are allowing reefs to be protected for something that may not really matter. We've got distracted. It's easy to count species. It's easy to identify forms. And that is what biodiversity conservation is based on, the number of species. We've got to get beyond that. We've got to move forwards, and we've got to work out what it is that we really want to protect. So, things to sleep on. Biodiversity on its own is past its use-by date. It's no longer, I believe, a useful metric for protecting or measuring the status of ecosystems. Aspects of biodiversity are critically important, but we now need to move on and identify and recognize those aspects. And the second thing is, can we sleep well at night? To answer the question, I believe the answer is no. Because in the GBR, we've got lots of biodiversity, but it is not going to protect us. We are just as vulnerable as all of the other places because we've got all those singletons. There's large chunks of our biodiversity that are not protected. So we've got to be very, very careful. We've got to move on. We've got to move beyond this simple protection, and we've got to identify the species that are important for the process that they support. We've got to protect those, and we should take our focus off the bright, the beautiful, the colourful. We've got to move beyond simple baubles. Thank you.